Good evening, everyone. This is a special meeting of the Board of Estimate Taxation, October 3rd. I'm glad you are all here and interested in the policies and procedures of the BET. It's been before us for about 4 months. But before we get to that, we have a presentation by the Hay Group regarding our HR policies and table of organization and the like. Just to give a little bit of background on this before I turn it over to Hay, we started this process several months ago. In fact, somebody asked me that today. Certainly it was throughout the summer. A review of the towns and Board of Ed HR function, which includes risk management. It includes elements of finance, elements of the town's HR, the Board of Ed HR, and culminating in a draft report. Let me emphasize the draft aspect of the report. As everyone can recall, the Nathaniel Witherell report and how that came out as a draft report and subsequently was modified significantly. Whether this report ultimately gets revised significantly or not remains to be seen. The BET will continue to review this report. We anticipate having this final report coming before us for our November meeting. So our regular October meeting, we still won't take it up. We will take it up at our November meeting. And similar to other reports, we will be issued a final report, and then we will vote on that final report. If it is adopted, as is customary is the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be completely instituted, but certainly a vote of this body for the acceptance of such a report. So, that being said, no one should look at this report and think that, one, we're voting on it tonight, or two, that everything that's contained in this report will be ultimately adopted by the BET. That will be for, quite frankly, future BETs, as this body will not take any action on this report other than approving or disapproving the final report in November. So with that, let me introduce Neville Kenning from the Hay Group, and I'll let you introduce the rest of your colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board of the BET and members of the audience. We appreciate the opportunity to be with you tonight to present this draft report. And Adam, I'll leave Adam Myers, who's the client relationship manager for the relationship with the town of Greenwich, to introduce the other team members to you.
Working with Neville on this project with Meredith Beringer, and he will also be available to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Adam. And as you're aware, Mr. Chairman, I believe each member of the BETs, have they received a copy in advance? Or they did? Okay. There are, I've been allocated maximum of 45 minutes, Mr. Chairman. That directive came from the chairman. So there's 53 pages in here. So what my intention to do is not go through page by page, but to talk at a high level to this report. The approach that I intend to take is put myself into your shoes and anticipate the questions that you may have. So the approach I intend to take is, why was this done? How was it done? What were the major findings? And what are the recommendations and the bases of these recommendations? And then finally, and to link into what you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, what's the game plan in terms of the next steps? I'll reference some pages as we go through if they're related to those particular questions. But first of all, in terms of why was this project done, if you go to page 6, which was the objectives of the project. The primary objective of this study is to help the town improve organisational effectiveness by clearly defining an organisational structure for the management and provision of HR and related functions. This was a straight take from the RFP, which was issued on behalf of the town. And what we turned that into was, rather than just a structure of HR, the term that you'll see used throughout this report is HR service delivery functions. because as you'll see in this report, HR service delivery occurs in a number of areas. There's some aspects in finance, there's some aspects in the town HR, there's some aspects that are in the BOE. Within that, what you're looking for was the primary driver of this is how you should be structured. Coming out of that was also what should the role definitions be, distribution of work, the right processes and systems. And also we were asked to look at what's going on externally. Should have mentioned by way of introduction my role in this. Within the Hay Group, I'm the practice leader for delivery of services to state and local governments, hence my involvement in this project. How was it done? I want to reference quickly page 7, which is the methodology that was used. The methodology that the Hay Group uses for a study like this is under the concept of organisational clarity, which contains 4 aspects to it: mission, vision, values, which sets the overall strategic direction of an organisation such as the town of Greenwich; the strategy, which are the means by which that mission, vision, values will be exercised. And then the 2 other aspects, which was the primary focus of the study, which is structure and process. The first 3 entities, mission, vision, values, strategy, and structure, if you'll excuse the term, are dead entities in their own right, because they can just be written documents on documents on a page, or organisation charts on a page. What gives those 3 things life are people and processes. And so while we were primarily asked to concentrate on what should the structure be, the means by which this will be given life is actually the people aspects and the process aspects. Continuation of the methodology on page 8. What we looked to do was actually consolidate the various means by which we did this study into some themes. Such as alignment with the town strategy and values, role definition, accountability, competency and performance, work processes and systems. And so I'm going to touch on shortly the different analytical tools that we used, data gathering and analytical tools, but in each case we've tried to categorize them into these particular project process, which was how it was done. There were 4 main data gathering tools that were used. Actually, there were 5, because in advance of us doing interviews, we asked for a whole lot of information from the town. And you recall, you asked how long this had been going on. The planning meeting was held on the 15th of June, so we set a target for presentation around this period of time. So we asked for a whole lot of information from the town in terms of its organisation structure, its cost of doing business in the HR area, job descriptions, those sorts of things. But against that background, there were 4 main data and analysis tools used. One was interviews. We're set out on page 12. The people that were interviewed to give us an overview of the issue, an understanding of HR, what's working, what's not. And I'll go through the findings from that shortly. The second major diagnostic that was used was this process called accountability mapping, which were 2 one-day sessions involving a cross-section of town leadership and town HR leadership. And what that concentrated on was getting put very simply, accountability mapping is about who is accountable for what and who should be accountable for what. So it's under the theme of clarity of accountability. The third instrument that was used was an HR effectiveness survey that was sent out to a cross-section that was sent out actually to all town employees, or a cross-section, a benchmark sample of 40%, was it? Was it roughly 40% of town employees? The focus of the HR effectiveness survey was the extent to which there was a connect or disconnect between the understanding of the services being provided by the HR service providers and the users of those services. Was there a connect or disconnect in terms of an understanding of how well they would be done, and more importantly, the level of importance? The fourth diagnostic that was used was benchmark analysis, where what we were asked to do in the Hay Group was look at, well, what's going on in the world of 2011 HR? What can we learn from I hate to use the term best practice, but what can we learn from others in terms of HR effectiveness? So very briefly, in terms of an overview of those, the interview findings, on pages 13 and 14, and the overall strength was a positive attitude and a high level of, and remember these are summary themes from the interviews, positive attitude and a high level of customer service orientation across HR, and the benefits area was also seen as a strength. The four major issues which were identified as potential inhibitors to HR effectiveness was unclear processes and accountabilities. And a theme that you're going to see throughout this whole report in terms of inhibitors to success is this issue of fragmentation. There are a lot of positions and roles that have their fingers in the HR pot. And so what that leads to is some inefficiencies of process. It leads to duplication of effort. And quite frankly, leads to who's accountable for what conversation. And so is that a structural issue? Is it a role definition issue? Is it a systems and processes issue? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. Because one of the challenges is which do we resolve first, and I'll come to that later on. But each of them in their own role has and that's why we use the term potential inhibitors to HR effectiveness. There's unclear role definitions. I touched on that. One of the significant issues is the systems and processes issues, which has an impact on the level of staffing. If you've got inefficient systems and processes, chances are you're going to have more staff than you potentially need because they're doing stuff that potentially the systems and processes, that enhanced systems and processes can handle. Summary of those which was set out on page 15, and what we attempted to do here on page 15 on the right-hand side was link those back to those 6 areas that we mentioned: alignment with town strategy and values, role definition, accountability, work processes, and summarize the 4 main themes from the interviews, which was unclear processes and accountabilities, disconnects between the perception of service delivery and the effectiveness of the current processes, unclear role definitions, and the lack of automated or interconnected systems. Now, members of the board, what you're looking for as you go through, so if we just pause there, we don't know if we've got sufficient information on which to make some recommendations. And so the reason why we did other diagnostics was to see what are the themes that are coming out from these other diagnostics. So the second second tool we used was accountability mapping, which is set out on page 17. I said accountability mapping is primarily an analytical tool that's used for creating understanding and clarity of expected accountabilities, or as in that first bullet, second sentence, put simply, it's about who's accountable for what and who should be accountable for what. And as a separate handout, we have a summary of what's called the accountability maps. Where are they? They're here. Okay, if I could just have one of those. So. Any questions? No. Basically what an accountability map does is down the vertical, down the left-hand side, it takes all the major, and these will be handed out at the end of the, it's not part of this, but it's a separate handout, correct, so you can see it. But basically what it does, it takes all the major functions related to HR down, and it's on a matrix down the left-hand side, and across the top, it has all the people that are involved in HR. And it basically goes through and asks questions related to who's accountable for policy, who's accountable for execution, and who's accountable for review, and what's the nature of that accountability. And so there's a whole lot of letters on here that you'll be able to see. Now, what we look for here is that if this is heavily populated from 2 perspectives. One is if there's a whole lot of accountabilities in one column, that means one position is overburdened. Secondly, if there's a whole lot of letters on this as we go across, then there's a lot of people involved in a lot of stuff. And in fact, that's what we found on the as-is. In the day 1, we did an as-is session. Then on day 2, We had the same functions down the left-hand side, but we had no positions across the top. We just called it position A, position B, position C, position D. And so we then said, okay, against those, which positions should be accountable for those functions, and what's the nature of that accountability? And what you hope for in the second session is that there's more clarity. There's a good number of accountabilities per column, and there's not the whole lot of letters across here. For example, one of the letters is what's called contributory. Contributory is advice counsel. If the first page has a whole lot of C's on it, I can guarantee people are always in a lot of meetings, because they're always advising and counselling, but no one's actually getting anything done. So that was another, and as I mentioned, that was done in a session with a cross-section of both HR leadership and town leadership. So that was the second tool that was used, and just by way of reference for that, on pages 18, 19 and 20, because it's related to the as-is, is the organisation structure of the areas in which those positions that were covered by the scope of the project are placed. And you can see the number of employees there. Now, the important part here is a summary of the themes, page 21. And this is good news in terms of us trying to look for some common themes. The initial interviews surfaced. The accountability mapping workshops confirmed the 4 major themes. Services provided by HR are fragmented. Secondly, accountability or ownership for the most of HR functions fall under the director of HR for the town. This leads to an overburdened HR director, which is probably why she got a bad back. Thirdly, there is overlap in HR between HR activities between the town and between the Board of Education. What we found was, and that's why I held up that map, if you go across a particular item, and I understand the role, particularly related to instructional staff or certificated staff, but in some of those non-certificated or instructional staff in the BOE area, you'd see the same accountability sitting in BOE as it does in the town. So the question that is posed is: does there need to be that duplication of effort just because it's serving a population in a different area? Because taken to its extreme, then why doesn't Parks and Rec have its HR function? And why doesn't Public Works have an HR function? And why doesn't Finance have an HR function? Because then otherwise we're organising by effectively location as distinct from organising by service. And fourthly, and we've already touched on this, the legacy system issues cause limitation and duplications of efforts within town HR as well as BOE. The current system, which is Munis, put quite simply, is out of date, and hence is creating, and it's being asked to do things that it wasn't intended to do. And 7 years in IT is about 3 times a lifetime, and so there is, it's creating manual process. This probably don't need to be, because Munis, which is the technology, can't deliver the sort of services that it was intended to be. And so then what set out on pages 20, 23 and 24 was effectively a summary of the what we call the should be. And members of the board, it was effectively about that day 2 of accountability mapping that for us as a team the light went on in terms of what potential solutions are to the enhancing HR effectiveness. And I've touched on it before, which says if we're going to eliminate duplication of effort, if we're going to, et cetera, we need to have a different way in which we're organised, and I'll explain that in the recommendations. The third tool that was used, which is set out in section 6, which is the HR effectiveness survey, and it contained 38 questions related to specific HR services in 8 major areas. And what this was done was to determine the extent to which internal customers' perception, internal customers being non-HR service delivery providers, of HR performance is convergent or divergent with the HR's perception. HR says, we don't think we're doing very well in that area. The customers say, we think you do great. Or, put another way, HR says, well, we think we're doing really well here, and the customers go, internal, which is basically supervisors, managers, employees, say, we don't think you are. The other thing was about related to what's viewed as priority between those who receive the service and those who give the service. So page 27, there was a 23% response rate. You may go, that's not very high, but we've got to look at the number of respondents. And by the way, this was done in an extremely short period of time. It was also done during vacation period in the BOE. It was an online instrument where all the all the responses came only to the Hay Group. There was no vetting of those at all internally within anyone in the town. It was set up by us, it was administered by us, and the responses came to us. There is a separate document that sets out a very detailed summary of the entire survey. What were the findings is set out on page 23. Most important services that that employees see is payroll, benefits, and retirement services. Retirement services was particularly popular with people who are over 55. I was just joking. There was also alignment in terms of areas were rated as the most important by HR, which is payroll, benefits, and orientation. It's interesting, the first two align to the employees' retirement services, which is the back door, is important, and orientation, which is the front door, which is important to HR. We want to get you on board properly. The customers perceived the HR performance lower than HR perceived itself in all 8 categories. The highest performing areas, as I've touched on before, was payroll, orientation, retirement services, etc. There's a lot of pages in here that I'm not going to go through in detail, and we've done a summary on page 30 of some verbatim comments. Now, it's important that everyone recognise that if there is any reference to names or clearly identified related to a position, then in doing the summary, we've removed that. We have removed any reference to names because we didn't want the breach of confidentiality to occur. Okay, the fourth area of diagnosis was external research findings. External research, which is on page 33. The main areas that we looked into and main areas of focus in the HR community for businesses at the moment are 4 areas. One is, how should HR be organised? Secondly, related to that, should be centralised or decentralised. The third area is shared services. And I'll give you for example in shared services. I did a lot of work with state governments. Should HR services be provided in multiple agencies, or should they just be done through the central HR? And related to that is also outsourcing. What should we be doing ourselves versus what should we outsource? And the main things that get outsourced are twofold. One is some transactional processes, such as payroll. The second area is those where we where we need an expertise from time to time, but we don't need it on an ongoing basis, and so we buy it when we need it, as distinct from staff up for it. There is as set out on page 34, there is no universal recipe. Here's the issues that we need to address. Are we operationally focused, or what is the areas in which we can add value? What's our burning platform issue? Are we looking to reduce costs, or are we looking to enhance service? Should we be centralised or decentralised? How complex is the organisation? For example, an organisation that is unionised is more complex from an HR perspective than one that isn't. And an organisation that is not 9 to 5 in terms of the nature of its service delivery is more complex. An organisation that has functions within it that, if they're in another business, wouldn't have anything to do with each other is also more complex. For example, state and local governments are complex organisations because you're running a nursing facility, you're running an education, you're running parks and rec, you're running public works. In a private enterprise, they would be probably be separate organisations. You wouldn't have a nursing position in the same organisation as a road engineer in the private sector. So that in its own right brings complexity, because while we're called one employer, the town of Greenwich, we are effectively got some separate businesses in it. So hence we have to have the need. We'll never get uniformity, but we've got to have consistency, which is consistent platforms in terms of the way we do, particularly what we call our enabling support functions, which is IT, HR, finance, legal. Those that provide support to the business need to be done from a consistent perspective. And so what we've set out on Hay Group partners with Fortune magazine, we've done this for 11 years now, to look at what are high-performing HR functions, and without getting into detail, set out on page 36 characteristics of high-performing HR functions. And the reason that we set that out is not to say, well, you necessarily need to be like that, but more importantly, what can we learn from high-performing HR functions as we move forward in terms of our design of both structure and our people and processes for HR. Okay, so the summary of findings set out on page 40 and 41. Based on all those diagnosis and analytical tools that we did, what we've done now is taken those 6 areas: alignment with town strategy and values, role definition, accountability, competency and performance, work processes, and systems, and summarised the findings from each of those diagnostic tools, and put them into a summary of findings for all those particular areas. And I've touched on some of these before, which is the first one is really an alignment issue, alignment between the strategy, the direction the town wants to go, and the HR service, the way it's organised and the way it delivers services. There's duplication of effort. There's a lack of clarity and expectations around some particular areas that are related to this, particularly risk management, workers' comp and safety. And what this is creating, and workers' comp is a good example, it's being done in different ways. And the biggest issue is on case management, and probably summarised best in workers' comp about who's accountable for what. There isn't overall accountability for the management of workers' comp, and that needs to be addressed. And so I've touched on most of these before. The other key thing that I would touch on is the lack of automated or interconnected systems. So against that background, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, what are the recommendations? And in preparing the recommendations in a draft form, one of the keys is to start with, we believe, in terms of our brief, was so how should we be organised? And so set out on page 44 is a proposed organisation structure. And if I do some commentary, I'll sort of give the setting of that, which is the commentary which is set out on page 43. The key to enhancing effectiveness HR service delivery for the town of Greenwich and reducing the fragmentation and duplication that currently exists is to organise into one HR department with centres of expertise based on centres of excellence based on functional expertise. Let's put accountability for benefits into one area. Let's put accountability for labour relations into one area, which it currently is. Let's create accountability for training and development, HRIS, recruitment selection, into one area. And let's free up the director of HR to be at a strategic and policy level rather than being involved in day-to-day activities. And as I touched on before, one of the main drivers of this proposed outcome was the should-be exercise and accountability mapping, where we effectively had duplication of process and duplication of accountabilities in multiple columns. Summary of the commentary on the proposed organisation. One is there'll be greater clarity and definition of accountability. 2, there'll be centres of functional excellence. 3, Labour relations, it's proposed, would report under the Director of HR. That is a trend that is occurring a lot in organisations where there is both labour relations and human resources. If you went back 15 years ago, most labour relations positions did not report into the HR function. The trend, particularly in the last 10 years, has been move labour relations under HR. The primary reason being that the outworking of labour relations is through the people, which is a human resource accountability. Fourth, and I'll touch on this more in the other area of recommendations beyond structure, is that there's tremendous opportunity for improvement, enhancement of systems and processes. Fifthly, one of the areas that is an increased accountability which currently doesn't exist is the area of leadership development. There was a comment made in the survey about lack of opportunities for growth in growth in managerial positions in the town because of its very fragmented structure where there's a lot of departments. It was very interesting, members of the board, when we went through and did the as-is accountability matrix and we got to the section called leadership development. And the answer for those so we said who's accountable for what in the session that we had in terms of leadership development. And if you look at the accountability map, that page is blank because they couldn't tell us who was accountable for what in terms of leadership development. And that's interesting in light of the comment about there's a lack of growth opportunity. Well, there's a connection between those two statements. I see a lack of growth opportunity in terms of managerial opportunities, and secondly, there's no leadership development going on. So one of the aims is to create greater accountability for leadership development, for leadership of the town, not just identify and develop who are good managers, not just good parks and rec managers, and not just good public works managers, etc. So page 44 sets out the proposed organisation structure in terms of the recommendation that's been made on the previous page. One of the reasons why, and you'll notice a change in reporting relationship of the Director HR to the Town Administrator, currently sits with the Office of First Selectman. We recognise that the role of First Selectman and Town Administrator is outside the scope of this study, but what we intend in proposing that is that the Town Administrator, the role of Town Administrator, and by the way, I should preface this, we have no names attached to this. We're talking about how you should be organised. Our role is to put aside whether we know names of incumbents or not. And that's the approach that we've taken. We've made no assumptions as to who would go into what box in making our recommendations. But what we believe is that it's important that a role such as the Town Administrator be an important have a very important ongoing role in terms of policy, consistency of policy across the town, and one of the important areas and support functions is human resources. Set out on pages 45 through 49, maybe I haven't gone far enough. 49 45 through 50 is that we were asked to do some brief bullet points of what the major accountabilities of the proposed positions will be. And the intention is if this organisation structure gets adopted, these key summaries of accountabilities would then be turned into job descriptions for these positions. But Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we were asked not only to look at organisation structure, we're also asked to look at process and systems as well. And we see the potential for significant cost savings in the future that have not been taken into consideration at this point through improved systems and processes. There is duplication of effort, there are manual processes being undertaken, there are checks and balances that exist because of the systems that don't need to exist because an enhanced system would not need that. Because the system would be able to provide that, and based on our experience, such as modernising payroll processes, we see a potential further savings of up to 50% of payroll resources. A further comment on processes, the overall accountability for the administration of workers' comp, which is fragmented at the moment, has not been done consistently, will be placed beneath the benefits manager. And what that would enable is establishment of consistent policies and processes that would be applied in all departments, a greater emphasis on case management, and establishing a service agreement with the TPA, third-party administrative vendors, in terms of accountability and performance. Related to that, on page 52, the systems. You may want to evaluate, once again, the first bullet point is outside the scope, but it was partially outside the scope. Evaluate current systems to determine if a new comprehensive and integrated financial and HR system is feasible. If it's not, we say you may want to consider a new human resource information system, which fully integrates all town and BOE data so as to avoid duplication and redundancy of effort. Related to that, at the bottom of page 52, is develop process flow maps for HR transactions such as payroll, onboarding, retirements, to ensure that these are being done in a consistent manner. And this should be a natural outflow from the proposed organisation structure, where now we'll have accountability for these major HR systems, HR processes sitting under one position from a leadership perspective. Now, that does not mean that the leader's doing all that work, but the ultimate accountability for example, workers' comp would sit with the benefits manager. So the ultimate accountability for recruitment and selection processes would sit with for the instructional side would sit with what we call the assistant director BOE, assistant manager BOE, and also what we call the manager BOE, and on the town side would be sitting with for the non-certificated instructional, for the rest of employees would be sitting with the assistant director. People and competency and performance. One of the important things here is to determine, and this gets the link into are HR staff equipped to do their jobs? Well, rather than comment on existing employees in existing structure, we've taken the perspective of we need to determine what is the appropriate structure for going forward, and then having fleshed out what the definition of the role is, then to determine what we call a competency profile, which are the behavioural attributes that are associated with it, and then match employees against the proposed role. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, that's an overview of our 53-page document. There are two other the accountability map that I held up will be available for all members of the board after the meeting. And then at some future point, we'll be able to provide the detailed feedback on the survey. So I'm more than happy to, for either myself or any members of the team, to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you. All right, so why don't we open it up again, just to remind the members of the board up here, we're not voting on this report tonight. This is a draft report. It'll come back to us in a final report, and we'll vote on it in November. Tonight is to try to get some of questions out there so that if you're looking for additional information similar to the HDG report, we can get that information to all of you in a timely manner. So with that, Mr. Raymer.
A couple of questions, if I can. In your report, you focused on cost savings. I think, including benefits, you were estimating those cost savings at about $487,000. In your oral comments and in the report, you also touched several times on the effective management of workers' compensation claims. Were you generally satisfied that if one were to adopt the table of organization along the lines of what you were showing on page 44, that there's also other operational efficiencies that one would operate the human relations operation more effectively, or was the objective here mostly cost savings and workers' compensation claims?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Raymer, what we're recommending is putting in place structure that will create greater accountabilities. With greater accountabilities, so we effectively are proposing, let's rebuild the house first. Then there'll be opportunities for potentially future savings in the areas of some of the areas where it's been identified that there are duplications of effort, lack of accountabilities, and you touched on some of those: payroll, workers' comp, being two main areas. Can we quantify the latter at this point in time? The answer is no. But we believe that the start point is to really hone in on this position will be accountable for. And probably the best way to summarise that is the words that we wrote on related to the workers' comp area, where we said if we get greater accountability, at the bottom of page 51, key enhancements that need to be made in the administration of workers' comp include the establishment of consistent policies and processes, greater emphasis on case management. Can I quantify the impact of that at this point in time? I could do some estimates which says potentially if we look at other organisations that created that accountability, there may be a 20% saving, but we haven't estimated that yet because that comes after we've got the accountability in place.
On page 27, you had indicated lower on the page there that you had a 23% response rate. You also mentioned that because the work was necessarily being done during the summer, there were people away, particularly on the Board of Education side, were away on vacation. You refer us to the appendix, but if you go back to page 56, you indicate that the appendix with the responses will be handed out on the separate cover, which I think was the document you were talking about distributing at the end of the meeting. Could I just get a sense from you about, on that response rate, how that might have divided between Board of Ed and town? Most particularly, what sort of a response rate did you get from the Board of Ed?
I'll get my colleague who has the big report, if that's right, Mr. Chairman. I'll get Megan to answer that question.
That'd be great.
So the BOE response rate, so people who were considered within the BOE, they may receive services from the town.
Right.
They were actually 58% of the response,
Wow.
whereas the town employees were 42%.
On page 44, where do you envision on the reporting process, on your table of organization on page 44, where do you anticipate having some responsiveness to the superintendent of schools, who I don't see shown on that grid?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Raymer, I think there should be a dotted line, the advantage of having a draft.
Okay, that's great.
There clearly needs to be a dotted line from to the superintendent of BOE for policy things that are BOE specific, such as recruitment of certificated instructional teachers. So that would be a modification that we'd be looking to make. The superintendent of BOE should not have totally disappeared from that page. So,
okay, I for one will be interested in the end to see.
Yeah.
Last comment, if I can, and it's addressed, I think, more to the chair than to the speaker. I for one would find benefit if, before we're voting on the Hay study, if we could be receiving and considering some comment and responses from some of the affected departments, most particularly, I think, the Board of Education. But I certainly would like to be hearing what their responses are, because they understand it much better than I do, and I think I'll understand how I should be responding to this study when I've listened to their comment. Is there going to be an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, for us to be getting some feedback from some of these other departments, most particularly the Board of Education?
Well, it sounds like you just asked for it. So to the extent that the Board of Ed is here, Superintendent Lulo is here now. Members of the Board of Ed are here. So to the extent that you wish to comment, and that goes for HR as well, I don't think we've ever had a report where we haven't received input from an affected department. Again, I go back to the HDG report, and in our deliberations, it's always useful to have that commentary back, recognizing that this is a public document. Their comments and their comments back will be public documents, and I think rightfully so. This is a taxpayer paid for report, and we should be talking about this with the public, and that's part of what tonight is about. So we certainly welcome all of the comments from whether it's HR, whether it's Board of Ed, whether it's the town administrator, labor relations, the first selectman's office. And with that timeline, we'll set something up. I'll comment on this at our October 17th meeting just to make sure everybody's aware of when we should expect documents after I've talked to the Hay Group, because I would like them to process those same comments. It's one thing for us to get, but it's another thing for the Hay Group also to have the opportunity to get those comments and that feedback so that we can generate or receive a report that has all of that taken into consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On this side, Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, thank you for this report. Sort of stepping ahead a little bit, but, obviously still expecting substantial input from all of us over the next month or so. What do you recommend is the best way to help us get ownership by all parties involved of the recommendations here? I guess that would be my first question. And number two, what then is the best way for everyone to work together to implement this? I mean, is it to work with Hay on, with implementation, do it ourselves? What kind of best practices have been used in the past for taking it to the next steps?
Mr. Chairman, and I can't see your name down there, but...
I'm Mrs. Tarkington.
Mrs. Tarkington, thank you for the question. And the sequence is important here. As you're aware, this is a draft report, and we would encourage what you just requested, Mr. Raymer. But as part of our November presentation of what the final looks like, one of the things that we do is that we take, you're not going to get 53 pages again, we would basically summarize the recommendations and take those and put them effectively into what we call a path to implementation. So to take a recommendation, it would say the work that needs to be done to make that implemented. It would say what the expected outcomes would be for that, and it would also show a timetable. And then the fifth column it shows is who's accountable for that, what should be owned, and there's three columns within that. What's owned by the town, what could Hay be doing, and then thirdly, what could be done together. So I can't populate it for you at this point in time, but what I've done is show you, sort of give you the framework of what it would look like. Now, in terms of one of those, there's the path to implementation has a column called communication, because you want every stakeholder, which is people such as yourselves, departments, HR service providers, at least at a level of what I call suspicious acceptance when you roll something like this out. And my definition of suspicious acceptance is I don't necessarily go along with it, but I'm not going to prevent you from doing it. And as long as you got 80% of people at least at a level of suspicious acceptance, then you can roll forward. One of the aims of this 6-week period should be to find out where the not quite yet suspicious acceptance is. Because you'll never satisfy everyone. But so I'm not populating
Right.
I'm giving you what the answer looks like. I can't populate it for it yet. But I'll give an example. I did a very much larger project during 2010. We were asked to produce a report like this, and it was at a legislative body, and they said, can you turn your recommendations into a game plan? So that's why I gave you sort of that framework. Because I think the focus of November should be a summary, and then how do we make this happen?
Perhaps you could, in the interim, just give us a one-page outline or additional page to kind of summarize that and put it on a piece of paper. It might be constructive.
I can do that. That's not a problem.
If that's all right, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Further questions or comments? Mr. Norton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to address your description of the benefits manager and how that fits in with the risk management function. And also, as a preface to that, the question I have initially is this an industry trend in which the workers' compensation process and workers' compensation programs are separated from risk management?
Mr. Chairman, Mr.
Norton.
The risk currently, if you look at page,
I have a couple of pages here, 46
yeah, but
and 51.
I go back to page
46 is where you begin.
with the current structure. If you go to page 20, page 20 remember there were 3 pages here that set out where the positions covered by the scope of this project currently reside. And they are in 3 areas. And you'll notice on page 20 there's a job called Risk Management Director, and it is currently vacant.
Exactly.
And so what our proposal does is that it effectively splits risk management into 2 areas. It takes effectively the human resource aspects of risk management, such as workers' comp, safety training, and says that's the impact of that is through, if you don't have an employee, you don't have a workers' comp claim. Sorry, if you don't have an accident, you don't have a workers' comp claim. But vehicles don't have workers' comp claims. Employees have workers' comp claims. Now, how can we, if we want the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, then we concentrate on workers' comp claims. If we want the fence at the top of the cliff, then in the workers' comp area, then we concentrate on safety, training, etc., etc. So the aspects that go into under the benefits manager, and that position called safety, training, workers' comp, are the human resource related areas. The other aspect of risk, which is effectively the insurance aspect of risk, the insurance policies, the liability, etc., would remain within the finance function. So we are splitting those two out in terms of risk management.
Isn't it true, though, that the employee injured in the automobile accident is covered by both the automobile insurance as well as the workers' comp claim? So you're splitting the same situation, the same incident.
Well, yeah, I guess you could argue that. I hope you don't have as many vehicle claims as you do workers' comp claims.
Well, anybody injured in an automobile accident who's an employee of the town, working at the time for the town, that's both a workers' compensation claim as well as some type of liability claim.
A liability for the vehicle. The intention of the risk part that remains in finance is effectively the creation of the management of the policy of that risk, which, as I said, is liability or things like that. The exercising of that through safety training, safety training, workers' comp would sit within human resources.
But you could place those services wherever you shall desire. They don't have to be specifically in the HR function to be able to provide those services. But when we go back to the first question, is it an industry trend within the corporate world in which they're splitting these responsibilities, these risk management functions?
Yeah, it is, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Norton, it is from the perspective of, if you look at risk, the modern risk position is really at a much higher level. It's about really enterprise risk, almost under a governance umbrella. What you're seeing is that the workers' comp, the trend is that you're seeing the workers' comp aspects of workers' comp safety, etc., sitting within the human resource function from an HR perspective.
And that's an area I think we're going to be looking to the finance department to also opine. You asked, Mr. Raymer asked about comments from affected departments. One of the affected departments is finance, and so we're going to be looking to him, particularly in this area, as to whether or not this is something that they agree in or disagree or just comment on. So we're going to be looking towards that arena. So thank you. Mr. Finger.
The stated goals are to enhance effectiveness, reduce fragmentation. I mean, as you know, the town departments reside in this building, ostensibly, HR department. Board of Ed resides in a separate building. Does the ability to increase effectiveness and reduce fragmentation get impacted by virtue of, I don't know how you propose taking the HR, the Board of Ed HR group, keeping it where it is, or moving it here? How does that impact the goals that you're trying to seek?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I can't see down there, Mr. Finger. Clearly, there's a preference to, if you want to create a team, that the team works together. But I think a more important thing from that perspective is the systems and process aspects. The two need to be seen together. We didn't look into one of the areas that we didn't look into was physical location of employees. I always take the approach that physical location should not be a barrier to deciding what a structure should look like. Other than if you've got three people in a cloakroom, then you're crowded. But I would not view that as an inhibitor if we think outside the box. If we say we want these people working together, we should be able to do it. But I think more importantly is to get common systems and processes so that they can that enables more effective communication.
Thank you.
Further comment or questions from this board? Mr. Mason.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. Greenwich lives with a old-fashioned New England government, and it's segregated into several appointing authorities,
Yeah.
and our charter lives within that. But we're not the only one that has that. Greenwich, through time, took some great effort to institute policies that we practice here that might be different than other communities. But with that being said, do we have this implemented elsewhere in a semi-similar type of government, this exact model in any way, and how was it done?
Mr. Chairman, I can't see the name, sorry, Mr. Mason. What you're seeing, I fully understand the not just Greenwich, but it's quite a common thing in the northeast in terms of the amount of citizenry involvement in local government and the number of entities that exist. What is it? New Hampshire has the third largest legislative body in the world, 425 legislators or something like that. So I call that full employment for all New Hampshires. I think the theme is about what will lead to effective HR performance in today's environment. And it's interesting, I was at a conference recently where there was an old timer said there's only two choices, centralization and decentralization, and we basically go between the two of them depending on what era, what decade we're in. What we're seeing is there's a trend towards centralization again. We went from centralized to decentralized and outsourced. And so the trend is back towards centralization centered around centers of excellence so that we can create greater accountability. And that really is the theme here. You're fragmented. We fully understand, no, we don't fully understand. You fully understand all the different entities that are involved in the governance of, the town of Greenwich. There's charter-driven, there's law-driven, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at what we call enabling support functions, and there's two parts. Let me give you a bit of theory here. There's two parts to any town. There's what we call the core business, and the core business are services that are provided to the external community: education, public works, parks and rec, nursing services, those sort of things. The outworking of those services primarily is seen externally. Internally are what we call enabling support functions. And they are they tend to be similar regardless of the nature of business. HR, finance, IT, legal. And the primary outworking of those services are to the internal organisation. What you're tending to see on HR, as I said, is we're almost coming a cycle where we're going, particularly in the public sector, there's a trend back towards centralisation focused around centres of excellence to create greater clarity and accountability. So I could go through, as I said, I do a lot of work with state governments. There's a number that were decentralised. All the HR was sitting out in the agencies. Now it's sitting back in central HR. So that's the trend that's occurring. The challenge for you is, as I said, the nature of your governance. One of the things that we said when we met here on the 15th of June is we'll start out here with our record, not with you, but with the planning meeting that we had. We'll start out here because there may be some things we need to move in here, as distinct from don't tell us all the reasons why things can't be done, because we'll start in here and then you'll end up in here. So I appreciate the fact that, as the chair mentioned to us before we started the meeting about the timetable and when we were told to produce it as a draft report, because the feedback that's been talked about here, it may cause us to come in here a little bit, but we didn't want to start in here. So I think what you're seeing is a trend towards the things that I touched on before.
Further comment? Ms. Kiernan.
I'll be able to read your name.
Wonderful. Just digging into the data a little bit on page 29, you mention here these gaps between the Board of Education and town ratings, and listed areas where there were a variance of 0.25 or greater. Can you scatter that for us? Was there a lot of variation on those ratings, or did they cluster around 0.25 or 0.30?
It's a good question. I would say the majority were around the 0.25 number. There were a couple with significantly larger gaps, and that can be displayed in the details of the findings.
And I guess a couple of other follow questions. Is this kind of the biggest driver then of consolidate or not? I'm sure there's other factors, but
No, it really, I mean, the purpose of providing this sort of information is to understand, number one, some of these services under the BOE customers might actually be provided by the town. I'm not exactly clear offhand what those are. But the importance here is what is being done well for a certain group and what can we learn for the other.
is it any way?
I'm
sorry. Is it in any way you're finding skewed by, by different structures in the two different settings, or by different management approaches, or by perceived delivery of HR functions by non-HR people? I mean, the thing that came to mind, recognition programs, and I have no idea if this is true, but perhaps teachers feel recognized by non-HR personnel in a way that's different from town employees.
I can answer that in terms of the driver. The HR effectiveness survey findings was one of the four means. But if I had to weight and I'm reluctant to do this in terms of, everything got driven off the HR effectiveness survey. The answer to that is not. The primary driver was really about the accountability and clarity. So I don't want to say it was driven off the accountability mapping, but I will say that the light went on in terms of what is potential solutions here following the should-be session on the accountability mapping, where it says, okay, if we want to avoid duplication of effort, we want to enhance accountability, et cetera, this is the way that we should do it. I think the HR effectiveness survey finding will have a life that will go. It'll be a very good input to getting back to the question that Mrs. Turkington asked about how do we make this happen. The HR effectiveness survey is something that can be utilised whether you change your structure or not in terms of enhancing the HR effectiveness, because it's provided some significant data on what things could be improved regardless of how you're structured. Now, that's not an excuse for not addressing the bigger issue, because then you say, we're potentially putting new wine into an old wineskin. What we're proposing is putting new wine into a new wineskin.
Okay. So why don't we proceed as follows? Because all of the affected departments are here, why don't we say that comments should be in to finance by October 14th? And the reason I'm picking that date is it's approximately 2 weeks. What I'd like to do is put this on our agenda as an old business item for our meeting on the 17th, just so that by then the comments and responses can be part of the packet, and that we can internally discuss it at our October 17th meeting, more for the point of if we have questions or you want a follow-up comment. So you receive a comment, say, from the comptroller that says the risk manager position is going to be problematic outside of the HR function, then we might want some additional backup. And then we'll forward that all on to the Hay group, and that way then we can then take this matter up at our November 21st meeting, if I have my dates correct. So is that clear? October 14th, comments from all of impacted groups to the comptroller. Hold on, Mr. Finger.
I was going to suggest not to give either department a shorter time period in which to respond, but maybe it's better to have them in by the 13th, since the packets go out on the 14th.
Okay, so the 13th.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raymer.
Would it be possible for those comments to be distributed among the body at the same time that you're passing them on to the Hay group?
No, absolutely. My point was just so that there's a clearinghouse with the comptroller. When our packets go out, it'll go out to the Hay group as well.
Thank you.
Further comments on the process? Yes.
I have a question then. In terms of timetable, and because we want to understand our time. So 13th, they come out to us is when they go out to the meeting the 21st, you would so working back from there.
Of November. So
yes,
13th
correct.
of October to us.
Correct. So you'll want clearly we'll be here for the 21st, but you want a document a week before that, 10 days before that, or what's your preference? Or
What
we
I'd
can
like
talk
to see is, at the very least, a week before that, to go to the two BET members who were instrumental in the overall process, Mr. Campbell and Mr. Simon,
Okay.
to make sure whether it's just a final overview
that's
before
fine.
then it's presented.
Not a problem. I just wanted to
1 week before, so November
14. I just want to make sure that we were clear on our date commitments into this.
That's
So
right.
That's good. Thank you.
Are there any questions? I know many of you here are for this topic, so are there questions about the process that we can, just so that everybody's in the room and we can all be on the same page in terms of a process? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, great, thank you. Mr. Finger?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion.
Well, let's wait.
Yeah, okay.
Let's wait for 2 minutes, and then we'll take that up. Okay. I can't believe everyone doesn't want to stick around for the policies and procedures of the BET. It really is an interesting read. All right, next time.
God forbid.
All right. So, Mr. Finger.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to approve the Board of Estimate Taxation Reference Book as marked draft September 26, 2011. That was included in our packet.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Finger, second by Mr. Pellegrino. I would normally open it up for you to give a little comment on how we got to where we are, but truly we've been working on this, and I want to thank both of you for working with the comptroller. I know a couple of times I called, whether it was you, Mr. Finger, or you, Mr. Pellegrino, in the morning, only to find out that you were together and meeting with the comptroller for what appeared to be almost every week for a period of time. And so this has come before us several iterations just last month. We took it up. We had the presentation by the law department regarding the budget process. I thought that was a healthy dialogue. And so we're here today with, I won't say small changes, but not voluminous in terms of the number of pages that were amended. And it's before us now. What I'd like to do is treat this document like we do our budget document or our guidelines, and that is the document before us has been moved and seconded. In order to change any page in here, there would need to be a motion to change a particular section or page or line item. Then we'll take up that motion, and then ultimately, once all of those motions are before us, then we will vote on the document as amended. Okay? So, Mr. Finger.
Couple of, I guess, housekeeping amendments or motions I'd like to propose. One is on page 38.
Okay, just bear with me, because I'm going to, on some of these, maybe we can just do by unanimous consent, okay?
Page 38,
Page 38.
okay.
This is not Appendix 38, this is page 38. The first full paragraph that begins with the words 7 affirmative votes of the BET.
Yes?
On the third line, will have deemed to have failed to act, and in the draft it says the prior year's budget. That should be current year's budget. That's taken from the charter, provision of the charter.
So the word prior is changed to current.
Correct.
Is there unanimous consent? Any objection to that change?
The charter language now.
No objection.
Thank you, Mr. Raymer.
Yeah, I don't object.
Okay, I don't know, I'd like to point out, on page 34, headed Adoption of BET Policies, in the first paragraph, there's a reference among, the second sentence, among the policies enacted by the BET are a debt policy, a fund balance policy, policy governing BOE major object code transfers, and a policy dealing with the BET Law Committee's authority to approve legal settlements, and then the parenthetical C appendix for these policies. I just want to point out that unless we've received something in the last day, on page appendix 43, it's blank right now. We are still awaiting from the law department a copy of the policy dealing with legal settlement approvals.
That's correct. We haven't received anything as today.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't know whether we want to strike this or whether we
I
want to wait.
prefer to strike it.
Okay, so why don't we just then, on page 34, I would move that on the second line, after a fund balance policy, insert the word and then strike on the next line from the words and a policy dealing with BET Law Committee's authority to approve legal settlements, that be deleted.
Is there any objection, and can we adopt that by unanimous consent?
Yes, no objection.
Okay.
Then I'll leave comments to others.
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman?
So we've had two amendments so far, all adopted, both adopted by unanimous consent.
Excuse me, I guess in that last motion, I guess implicit in that was that we were deleting page appendix 43.
That's correct. But thank you for just pointing that out. That's next month.
Right. Okay.
I see that we're down to two people in the audience, two members who are going to be joining this august group in January. Have you received a copy? I've been trying to get you copies. Okay, I just want to make sure that you have this document. It's a good study guide. Okay. Are there any other motions relative to the handbook? Mr. Raymer.
Perhaps the chair wants to go in chronological sequence of the pages. I may not have several, and maybe the logical way to do it is to flip pages, but I'll do whatever, I'll be obedient.
Okay, you have several. Mr. Huffman, how many do you have?
One.
All right, we're going to switch you, Mr. Raymer.
Less is more.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, back right on page 34 where we were, the lead paragraph of the page refers to these other policies and indeed notes that you can find them in the appendix. Accordingly, I see no reason for the description that follows under the heading Financing of Capital Projects and Debt Management. I would move that we strike that down to where it says Internal Audit Policy.
Strike the whole.
Strike the entire section. Because it's duplicative or inconsistent at worst.
So I'm sorry, and then I'll ask for a second. You're looking to strike everything under the subheading of financing borrowing policy?
Financing of capital projects and debt management.
And the 5 paragraphs that follow.
And the 5 paragraphs that follow until you get to internal audit policy.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second that to bring it to a vote.
Discussion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pellegrino.
I would not agree to this. This is a section that spells out those policies in plain English. I see no reason to remove it from the handbook.
Further discussion. Mr. Campbell.
Can I ask Mr. Huffman, you referred to possible inconsistencies. Have you found inconsistencies that we should be concerned with?
Well, I haven't taken it word for word through, but I am troubled by some of the language that is an abbreviation, I believe, of the provisions with regard to sewer-related projects and the sewer maintenance fund projects. I just don't think that we gain anything by a shortened recitation of what is already set forth in another policy, which is in the, or attached to this very document.
If I may comment again, I find it very helpful to have the summary. The purpose of the handbook and reference book is for all members of the BET to be able to quickly look at and understand policies, and I think it's particularly helpful for new members that are coming on. And I would not want to subtract from the body of this work and think that everyone has to keep going back to an appendix where the actual documents are without having a simple understanding of it up front. So I just stand in opposition to this.
Mr. Finger.
I too oppose deleting this whole section for the reasons that Mr. Pellegrino stated. This handbook is meant to be a tool for BET members to use as a reference guide in understanding how the BET operates. What I would suggest or put forward for Mr. Huffman's consideration, at least on the third paragraph, if we make the deletion of the two words on the first line sewer related, so that paragraph would read, the BET, upon approval of the annual capital budget appropriations for projects in the sewer improvement fund, et cetera, which more or less tracks what's in the charter, whether that would be sufficient to at least deal with the sewer fund concerns that he has. And I'll wait for a response on that before I deal with another issue in one of the other paragraphs.
All right, but I don't want to take up more than one amendment. I heard why you're addressing it to Mr. Huffman. I suspect if he wants to trade off, you would be inclined to vote for something not for his amendment, but for the substitute amendment. So I understand why you were telegraphing that. But we are going to, unless Mr. Huffman voluntarily withdraws his motion, we're going to take it up after discussion. And then, Mr. Finger, I'll recognize you at least for that amendment should Mr. Huffman's fail. Mr. Norton and then Mr. Raymer.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in opposition to Mr. Huffman's motion because I think that the first section of this and the appendix serve two different functions. Maybe one is to identify what we are doing, and the second, the appendix, the intent of an appendix, is to explain the provisions that have already been established. So that I think that where we have both the procedures and policies and then an appendix, the two separate and distinct sections of this whole policy, and they serve two different functions, and therefore I don't think it makes any sense to delete, and it's be incorrect to delete these paragraphs.
In partial response to the very appropriate question from my colleague, Mr. Campbell, where he asked, is there any focus in particular on places where the debt policy, which is the next at page 37 of the appendix, at places where it's inconsistent. I did focus during the process of reviewing this, that on page 34, the portion we're looking at right now, is the rather clear, rigid language in the first paragraph of what we're talking about. Halfway through the line, it says, it will be the policy to finance projects, and it goes on to talk about 2-year bans and 5-year bonds. And then at the end of the second paragraph, it says, provided that the final installment shall be due not later than the 5th year after their due date. As we were struggling with the debt policy, if I can refer your attention to the appendix at paragraph 38, we were aware of a minority view. It's not a minority view that I share, although I'm sympathetic to it, that there are people on our board who were more open than I, more open perhaps than the majority, to the idea of financing over a longer period of time. And to be gentler with that minority view, we in the debt policy, if you look at paragraph 38, in the second full paragraph, line 2.
Well, hold on. You've lost.
I'm so sorry.
What page?
Appendix 38.
Appendix
38, which is where we've appended the debt policy.
Right.
And in the second full paragraph under debt structure, second line,
Right.
we carefully picked over and found the diplomatic language at that time. For the general fund, the preferred financing model historically has been for amortization of debt. It was a way in which we wanted to declare our policy for 2-year bans and 5-year debt without being too harsh yet on the minority that have never prevailed upon the majority about the idea of longer term. And that gentler language, for example, did not carry forward to the summary, to use Joe Pellegrino's language. To me, that's not important, but I did think that we could have been more diplomatic here. And it is a place to answer Mr. Campbell's question where perhaps our summary is inconsistent with the actual debt policy where we had hammered out the language at that time.
Further discussion?
I'd like to call the question.
Well, we generally don't, in terms of giving people an opportunity to comment. Let me just say on this that, one, I don't find it inconsistent, and two, the reason why this is before us tonight is that this has been before us for about 4 months as a board, and I know people have commented on it and specifically commented on it. And so if there were going to be questions concerning whether it was inconsistent, that should have been an easily answered question tonight, when one would have looked at this and looked at it in the context of the total document. And so I'm not inclined to support that because, one, I don't see that it's inconsistent, nor have I been told that it's inconsistent vis-a-vis then a generalized statement that it's potentially inconsistent with other areas of this document. Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye, and to vote for it, just to be clear, I feel like the moderator a little bit up here, and all these, whether you're for it or against it. If you're voting for the amendment, you're for the request to delete everything under financing of capital projects and debt management up to the heading internal debt audit policy found on page 34 of the agreement of the document. Okay. So all those in favor of the deletion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Mr. Huffman? Any others? All those opposed?
Opposed.
Abstentions. Okay. So we have 11 of us tonight. Mr. Kelly has a family obligation, and so it's 1, 10, 0. That amendment has failed. Mr. Finger, I said I was going to recognize you.
I'd like to make two separate amendments.
Let's keep them separate.
Okay. The first one would be, again, dealing with page 34, the third paragraph under financing of capital projects and debt management. I move to strike on the first line the words sewer related, so that the first sentence or the paragraph would read, the BET, upon approval of the annual capital budget appropriations for projects in the sewer improvement fund capital budget, will authorize general obligations, et cetera, et cetera.
Is there a second? Is that you, Mr. Raymer?
Yes, I'm sorry.
It's been moved and seconded. Discussion.
I think I'm making the motion in an attempt to clarify that we're talking about the sewer improvement fund sections of the charter, which address it's not as nebulous as just sewer-related projects. A specific sewer improvement fund capital budget, and those items are addressed in the charter.
Fair enough. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. And is your next motion for the paragraph below?
No, it's actually for the paragraph. Well, it would be, yes, the same for the paragraph. Thank you for pointing that out. The same for the paragraph below. Delete on the first line the two words sewer related.
Seconded.
Mr. Raymer seconds. Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0.
So I guess I have a third one.
Okay.
Hearing the comments that Mr. Huffman made with regard to debt fund policy or debt policy and the comments Mr. Raymer made, maybe if we added some language that I'm going to propose, this might satisfy some of their concerns. This would be in the second paragraph under financing of capital projects and debt management. And I read, starting, I'll just pick up from the third line, one or more series maturing in annual installments of principal in compliance with the general statutes of Connecticut as amended provided the final installment, and then I would add, consistent with the BET's debt policy, capital D, capital P, shall be due not later than fifth year after their date. The reason why I'm proposing this is at least there's a direct reference here to our debt fund policy, to our debt policy, excuse me.
Question for clarification. First, Bill, could you first reread that for me so I can just pick up what you're saying?
Okay, I'll read the entire paragraph. It would read, the BET, upon approval of the annual capital budget appropriations for general public and school projects in the general fund capital budget, will authorize general obligation bonds to be issued in one or more series, comma, maturing in annual installments of principal in compliance with the general statutes of Connecticut, comma, as amended, comma, provided the final installment, comma, consistent with the BET's debt policy, initial cap D on debt and policy, comma, shall be due not later than the fifth year after their date.
The only thing, so as I'm looking at Appendix 37, we call it Appendix 37, we call it the Town of Greenwich debt policy.
That's fine.
So to be consistent, it's not the
Change to
BET.
consistent with the Town of Greenwich debt policy.
Right.
Okay.
Well, hold on, I'm starting to get very concerned that Mr. Raymer is so accommodating. Okay. Mr. Simon.
So what is the date exactly? Doesn't the word date need some modification? Is it the issuance date? Is it what date are we talking about here? This is a question really for Peter Bernarski.
That would be the issuance date on the OS.
After their issuance date? I think we need an adjective there.
No later than the fifth year after their date.
That has to be the issue date.
Yeah, that would
Issue
be the
date.
date that's located on the official statement for each issue.
After the issue date?
Yeah,
It has to be after the issue.
All right, but this is not part of Mr. Finger's motion. I understand that it's part of,
I'll make my next motion after this.
fair enough, and we'll eventually get to Mr. Raymer, who I've ignored since Mr. Huffman's motion, so. Okay. Before us, the words consistent with the Town of Greenwich debt policy after installment and, in between installment and shall on the fourth line of the second paragraph under finance of capital projects and debt management. Question. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Mr. Simon?
So do you think this should read after their issuance date? I think there should be a word in there before date, since date's not really spelled out. It's not clear. Date, issuance date?
I don't think it's necessary, Larry.
Well, good. I didn't know what it was. How do you?
Point of information.
Hold on. Mr. Simon, are you putting that as a motion right now?
Yes.
Okay. Second by Mr. Raymer, Mr. Huffman.
Just a point of information is it's practice in the industry to pick a maturity date, which is what's really relevant here, which may or may not coincide with the issue date and may be off by days or a month or even 2 or 3 months. So I think you're trying to deal with an ambiguity, which is one of several here, but you potentially creating a bigger problem.
How about proposing a solution?
I'm sorry, Mr. Huffman. I mean, you have an expertise in this that many of us don't. So I'm certainly somebody who is interested in the following answer, or in the answer to the following question. Would you leave this wording alone?
It's not really good the way it is, but just issuance date is not the best correction either.
Give us a solution.
What you need is to not later than 5 years after the initial date of maturity. Maybe that'll solve it.
Oh,
That's definitely
you know,
I don't know.
Mr. Pellegrino, because I'm sinking in this morass
No,
here.
I can see this in two ways. One is I can appreciate what Mr. Simon wants to do here for clarity. And I could understand if we that would be fine. But I'm starting to get into other comments on this is starting to micromanage, as far as I'm concerned, what's supposed to be plain English, and the policy already exists in the appendix. The whole purpose of this, again, is just to get someone a quick read to understand what this is about. So I would go in either of those two directions, either leave it as it is, or I would say 5th year after their date of issuance.
Just said 5th year.
All right, further discussion. Mr. Mynarski, do you want to weigh in on this?
To make it clear, you can put their date of issuance in there. Clearly, if, for example, that they're issued January 26th of the year 2011, they have to be amortized within that 5-year period. That's what I believe was the intent of this wording, even though it could be, as Mr. Huffman says, off by a day or two.
5th year.
5th year period.
After well, 5th year after their date of issuance is close enough.
Question?
Okay. Oh, yes, question?
We do have language in the debt policy. Would that be sufficient? So Appendix 38, second paragraph, under D,
This is not greater than 5 years.
just amortize no more than 5 years?
In the 5-year period, the start date would be the issuance date.
Right.
It sounds like it's the issuance date, but okay. I mean, that's the way I read it. But Mr. Fink,
I agree with Mr. Pellegrino. This is just a guide. And as Ms. Kiernan pointed out, and because this amendment we just made about referencing the Greenwich debt policy, there is a direct reference to the debt policy which is the controlling document. So it sounds like if we use the word after their issuance date, we might be contradicting by a few days what the intent of the debt policy is. So I think maybe we're better off just leaving it the way it is. And if there's any ambiguity, we refer to the debt policy.
Mr. Chairman?
hold on, Mr. Simon, then Mr. Norton.
I mean, the point of this, as mentioned earlier, was to provide in a summary something someone can understand that's on the BET. I don't see it hurts to say shall be due not later than the 5th year after the date of issuance. That's certainly a better construct than their date, which has no relevance whatsoever.
Mr. Norton.
Peter, when we issue these instruments, are they issued on a 360-day cycle or are they issued on a 365-day cycle?
365.
Okay, so some of them are issued on 360 days.
Okay. You remember?
I know, you don't want to hear from me.
Ms. Tarkington.
There may be exceptions to this. There might be holidays or weekends or so forth, and so you'd actually,
It's supposed to be
a day or two.
general statement.
Well, once you start doing that and become so defined, it's not quite so general. I just would rather leave it the way it is. I think it works.
Okay, so this is one that we're going to take to a monumental vote. I'm sure it will be reported widely in the press. Mr. Fenner.
I just point out that if we're going to make the change here, we need to make a similar change in the 3rd paragraph and in the 5th paragraph at the end, where we talk about 20th year after their date in both instances.
All right. Yes.
Is he amending it?
No, it's Mr. Simon's motion. It's been seconded by Mr. Raymer. I appreciate it. All those in favor of the Simon motion to add of issuance after the word date in the 2nd paragraph under financing borrowing policy signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Raise your hands, please.
What is the wording? I'm
A
sorry.
date of issuance.
Issuance.
After the date of issuance.
After their date, and
No, I think the motion was the date of issuance. Is that correct,
after
Larry?
the date of issuance?
There. No, it's their date
No, hold on.
of issuance.
Could be their date of issuance, because
Their
that
date,
probably
okay,
refers to
okay.
the bond.
Their date of issuance. So adding the word of issuance after the words their date. You only get one vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That passes. 7, 4,
Who were the no's?
0. The no's
Who were the
were
no's?
Mr. Campbell?
No.
You were a yes? Ms. Tarkington was a no.
I'm a no.
Mr. Norton, Mr. Huffman, and I was a no more by counting votes. 7-4.
So we're doing that in those
Passed.
those three paragraphs? Larry or Steve?
Well, we should do it in the third paragraph and the fifth paragraph then. Just make the same changes.
Can we take that up by unanimous consent?
Yes.
7-4. No, it's by unanimous consent. Thank you. All right. Of issuance.
Perfect.
Peter, do you have this? Because you're going to have to give this to Elaine.
I have it also, Peter, so.
Not so
Okay.
bad.
Mr. Simon, is that it?
Yes.
Mr. Raymer?
I have a few changes there, the same as the ones that I circulated. In one or two places, I'm going to propose, after some dialogue with Mr. Pellegrino, I'm going to propose some language that with which I'm trying to soften what I'm asking for to try and draw a greater consensus. I go first to page 6, if I may.
Please.
At page 6, under meetings and records, the first sentence presently reads that in addition to regular meetings, this will come up again on page 22, in addition to regular scheduled meetings, the chairman may call special meetings of the BET upon the request of any 4 members. I had originally proposed that there be some language there that would allow for the special meetings to be called on a lesser, at the request of 4 members. I'm going to abandon that point, but pick up on it, if I may, on page 22.
Okay.
I'll go next to page 21, if I may. At page 21, in the material that I circulated to you, I had raised questions as to why we were doing the discussion for a second time of the Taxation Non-Procurement Fund. And in our caucus, I was educated as to a fact which I did not realize, and that is that fund operates as a revenue fund as well, which explains its relevance to have it here. And because of that, I'm going to abandon the change here as well, if I may, unless somebody has objection to that. I now come, if I may, to page 22. At page 22, about 2/3 of the way down, under Rules of Procedure at Meetings, in the second paragraph, the first sentence reads, "An agenda for each meeting shall be prepared by the chairman in advance of the meeting." I won't read the rest of the language, but suffice it to say that there's no provision here for an item of agenda to be placed on any meeting by any other mechanism besides from the sole source of our chairman. And without my expressing in any way any dissatisfaction with the very terrific chairman that we've had for a very long period of time, including our present chairman, it does seem to me that there's a piece there that strikes me as being somewhat undemocratic. I thought that there should be some process by which an item can be brought to a proposed item of agenda can be brought to the attention of the meeting. And I distributed some language to my caucus chair, Mr. Salmon. I don't know if you passed my wording on to Mr. Walco.
I did.
You did. The language, but for the benefit of the others, what I'm going to propose is not what's written here, but what I'm going to propose is something which I thought had been our long-standing practice here, and that is, after having said the first sentence that the agenda is prepared by the chairman in advance of the meeting, I was going to add a sentence that said, items may be added to the agenda of any meeting upon a motion of a member, seconded and approved by 2/3.
Okay, so amend your motion to, all right, so it would be to strike the no and simply put items may be added to the, and then so forth and so on.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Norton.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to refer back to page 6, which identifies what a quorum of the BET is.
That's not the motion.
Yes, it is the motion, because a quorum of the BET is 7 members,
Yes.
and 2/3 of 7 would be 4 people. So an item could be put on the agenda with as few as
Be 5 people.
5 people.
Okay. Further questions, and then Mr. Finger?
First of all, I don't think you received a second, and I would like to second that.
Okay, thanks.
And I just want to point out in sort of response to Mr. Mason's comments. I think this, not I think, it's section, page 23, or whatever, page 22, we're talking about the full BET meeting and the procedures. Page 29 addresses BET committee meetings, and under the heading on page 29, setting agendas, paragraph 2 specifically states that the chair of the committee the chairman of the committee sets the agenda. He, she may do this in consultation with the members of the committee and/or with professional staff, or as he, she sees fit, and subject to inclusion of additional items to the agendas upon the request of at least one half of the members of the committee. So there is precedent for allowing members of the committee board to add an item, and what Mr. Raymer is proposing is specifically following Robert's rules, which requires 2/3 as opposed to 1/2, which is what we set forth for committees. So that's another reason why I think it's an appropriate motion, or an appropriate change.
Further discussion. Mr. Brady.
Steve, one of the things you should look at is the BET in full and the committee of the BET are all governed by section 1-225 of the Connecticut General Statutes. That's the FOI stuff. There's two things. One, it distinguishes between regular and special meetings. And the regular meeting is the one you post for the entire year prior to the end of the year. On those meetings, if the law permits the agenda to be amended by 2/3 of those present. You may not amend the agenda of a special meeting. It can only be for a special meeting of any of the bodies. It is what is posted, period of end of session. So that the amendments would only apply to regular meetings.
I didn't know that. Thank you, Mr. Brady. I didn't know that.
That applies to the RTM too.
Excuse me?
Applies to the RTM too.
Yeah, I know that.
Anything that's a lie.
Yeah.
Further discussion. All those in,
I think you initially started your comment by asking me my thoughts, and I just want to thank you for modifying your language from where you were originally, so thank you.
Mr. Pellegrino, I'm always interested in your thoughts.
okay, so just to be clear, page 23, we're striking the words note all the way through considered and replacing them with the following. Items may be added to the agenda of any meeting upon motion of a member, seconded and approved by 2/3 vote of the members in attendance at that meeting.
So that has to be changed.
Well,
Because he says it should be any regular meeting.
okay, but so I heard Mr. Brady and I appreciate his comments. So does home rule affect that? Does our charter at all implicate that? I mean, my only concern is rarely, if ever, do we take a legal analysis without the law department here. If it's the will of the body to change it just to regular meeting, that's fine. But if we're governed by the statutes anyway, I would submit to you to leave it broad. You're going to be taking these up again in January and make that change. But I wouldn't want to handcuff anybody at this point because clearly our practice has been, just so it's clear, whether it's in violation of law or not, if someone wanted to amend the agenda today on 2/3 vote, I would have accepted it. And that's been our practice.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to propose the broader language that I originally proposed. As if and when it becomes relevant to a meeting, we can then get the advice and counsel from our capable town attorney.
Well, we've already given it back to the policies and procedures to give us our law settlement policy. We'll add on this wording to see if we would like to amend it from any to regular meeting.
Thank you.
To accomplish that. I think it's a quick question for the law department to validate what Mr. Brady said, and it's a simple change.
Thank you.
I hope that there are no special meetings between now and December.
Me too.
Are we proposing that this language be added at the end of the paragraph?
Yes. No.
At the end of that second paragraph?
No, this language, as I said, 23, there's a note right there. Strike.
We're adding it at that point.
Strike that whole one sentence, note, and add in the language that I just, which with a little asterisk that says to be continued. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In terms of the special or regular, or any.
We haven't voted on this item yet.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0.
You're on a roll.
I guess I am. Page 23, if I may propose.
Sure.
In page 23, I would like to make a subtle change, if I can, 5 lines from the bottom, late in the line, is a sentence that presently reads, BET members should refrain from making statements at such hearings. By the way, I have no quarrel with the clear and compelling wisdom of that advice. That's good advice. But for the sake of this instrument, rather than have the instrument teach me manners, which probably could be taught to me at any time, I'm going to propose slightly different language. I'm going to add the word generally at the beginning of the sentence and strike the word should. So we'll read, generally, BET members refrain from making statements at such hearings. So you're not giving us advice as to our etiquette. You're merely making an observation as to what is our custom and practice.
All right, so hold on, before a question. Is there a second to this amendment? It's 2 words.
Second.
Okay, so it's moved by Mr. Raymer, second by Mr. Simon. Mr. Pellegrino.
I guess, Jeff, what I'd like to know, in your mind, what do you think is the difference between what you're suggesting and what's there?
I felt that this is an instrument which should be an expression of what our customs and practices are, rather than an instrument which is giving us advice as to how we should comport ourselves.
But I see a difference, and that difference being if a member wishes to comport himself versus a member who does not wish to comport themselves. And I guess I would feel that I'd rather have it as a directive so that it's clear to every member how they should conduct themselves, because I don't know if there's a member or members that would not adhere to that and therefore be disruptive in a public hearing. And so I have to say, I have to oppose this, because I think you have to be clear here of what's expected of us as members of the board at a special hearing versus the hope that a member would not become intrusive and want to start expressing their thoughts at a public meeting. So I oppose this.
I'm respectful of Mr. Pellegrino's comments. I just ask that we bring it to a vote. It's not an important point, and we'll pass on to the next item.
Okay?
Well,
Not important.
Okay.
further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Hands, please. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed?
Nay.
Opposed.
Must be 7, no?
7-0. That fails. Can we get by unanimous consent a space in between hearings and all?
Yes.
Same page, right at the bottom, just for formatting purposes. There's a paragraph above it, which is the 2 sentences that Mr. Raymer just described, and then all hearings should. There should be a line in between it consistent with the remainder of the document.
I'm at page 26, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So yes, unanimous consent?
Yes.
Peter, you have
sorry.
that change? It's a minor one. It's just a space. It's a line.
Spacing.
No, it's unanimous consent. Okay. Mr. Raymer.
I'm on page 26. As to this, I simply ask the pleasure of the body. I'm merely aware that our custom has been a little different over the years than what we've done, than what Robert's rules call for. Robert's rules suggest that committees are established for a purpose. If committee's life comes to an end, whichever first occurs is between 2 events. One is the completion of the task that was assigned to the committee, and the second is the finish of the term of the body that appointed them. We've never gone through a process over the years of doing a ratifying vote or whatever at our organizational meeting biannually in January, in which we vote to have a standing committee. And I wanted, frankly, just to bring that arcane point from Robert's rules to your attention and ask if anybody cares to add a sentence at the top of page 26 that calls upon us to have a vote each 2nd January to ratify the existence of our standing committees. I have no strong feelings either way. I merely wanted to bring this to the attention of the body.
May I respond?
Sure.
I would prefer to leave it as it is.
Further discussion?
I've heard no second.
Second.
Oh, all right. Sorry.
Okay.
I was hoping not to get a second, actually, Randy, but it's good.
Okay, moved and seconded, and we'll get the exact language. Let's just
So,
talk.
so I guess to make my motion clear then, I suppose I should be then moving to add a sentence, a second sentence, which would go into the fourth line, which says that biannually the BET will vote the approval of its standing committees.
Well, are you talking about the existence of them or the membership therewith?
No, the membership, as I understand the charter and as I understand other provisions here, the membership is a prerogative of appointment by our chair. And our chair has always graciously spoken with each caucus to come to some agreement. But in fact, the appointments of both the chairs and the memberships of the committee, as I understand the charter and our policy and procedures manual, is entirely the prerogative of the chair, and I wasn't seeking to disturb that. I was only looking, I was only trying to deal with what I thought was a requirement under Robert's rules, that if we're going to have a standing committee called the Audit Committee, then every second January we're supposed to hold a vote saying, for the next 2 years we're going to have a standing committee called the Audit Committee. And so too with all the rest of our standing committees. This is getting to be more to his worth.
Mr. Huffman.
And I think this is valuable because we should be looking at what our committees are, including standing and the liaison positions, I believe, because we do have to decide how we will commit our resources. And I think it's important also because we're coming upon a time when we're going to have a significant turnover in membership on the BET. So I would endorse this amendment.
I would just take a slightly different approach. As you look at this document, as you vote on this document come January, they're listed there, and implicitly you're voting on those standing committees when you vote on this document. Obviously, if there are liaison positions and special project teams, those change probably, not even probably, much more frequently than our standing committees. Our standing committees have had a role, historically have roles, and if they're not needed, they simply don't meet, and there are no resources committed to them. And so I caution with overburdening ourselves with even more formalities and then having further discussion at the beginning of a term about whether or not there should be a liaison to health or what have you. And so I would, again, leave it up to the chair and just remind everyone that the chair is voted on by everyone. And in fact, both caucuses have equal votes going to the chair. And so if, in fact, there's a disagreement over whether it's a standing committee assignments or liaison positions or special project teams, then simply you don't vote for that individual as the chair. And so I think the system has worked. I think it's worked quite effectively. And I think for the most part, with rare exception, has there ever been a disagreement regarding assignments. And so I think as it has historically worked, and I don't think in the future there should be any reason why it wouldn't continue to work. Mr. Finger.
I appreciate the sentiment of both Mr. Huffman and Mr. Raymer. However, I point out again, page 4, the preface, there is the statement that the third paragraph, last sentence, the Board of Estimate and Taxation shall vote to accept the reference book biennially in even number of years at its first regular meeting in January. So, in essence, every 2 years when we have a new BET, we are in fact voting to approve these standing committees. So I'm not sure that we need to put in here those requirements that Mr. Raymer or the words that Mr. Raymer included in his motion. It's effectively taken care of every 2 years when we approve this. And if we have issues at that time, people could, make a motion to strike a particular standing committee or a liaison committee.
All those in favor of the Raymer-Huffman motion to amend page 26 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. 2-9, I believe.
2-9. Opposed? Thank you.
Nay, thank you.
All right, moving on, Mr. Raymer.
Yes, at the bottom of page 30, I wonder if there's any, with all the lawyers on this bench, I guess I'll call it a bench, I'm looking at the citation that appeared at the bottom of page 30. I've never seen such a citation before. And I'd be inclined, if nobody can understand what it's a citation to, I'd be inclined just to delete that citation.
Should be CGS.
No, that's not how we cite to the Connecticut General Statutes. The Connecticut General Statute is CGS, and then an article number, then a dash and a section number. And I looked to see if there was an Article 25305 that related to this, and there was not.
I saw that, and I was hoping that someone would follow up the law department. Mr. Finger?
I seem to have left it in our caucus room. I'd actually copied a page from the Connecticut State Statutes dealing with education issues, and the first notation, I'm sorry, Randy has it, Mr. Huffman has it. You'll note, Mr. Chairman, that at the top of that page, there's a reference to that specific statute, that citation for governing the Board of Education. So, clearly it refers to something, and I can't sit here and say specifically what it refers to.
CGS?
But it's not CGS, and that's the citation used from.
Would there be any great harm in just taking that out? I just don't want to have a reference to something, but none of us, if not one of us, know what it is.
Statutes of CGS? Yes.
Well, so we just say, then, you're suggesting that it just be, and the general statutes of the state of Connecticut without the reference?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's
Was
fine.
it a 25 CGS? That's my question.
Is that
That's a motion.
Is that by unanimous consent?
Yes.
I will say this, though. I find it helpful, at least especially if we're referencing this, and, excuse me, I'm looking at this document, and it's interesting to me that it does say 25 CS 305. It does also reference Section 10-218 of the Connecticut General Statutes. So maybe this is item 3 for the Policies and Procedures Committee. Just to circle back again, it was in there. We should understand why it was originally put in there, and then take it from there. That should be an easy find for our esteemed law department. Mr. Raymer, any more?
Yes. The next page that I had distributed had suggested changes on page 34. In light of the lengthy dialogue that's already taken place as to that section, I think I'm just going to shrink away and not speak further to those. I am going to go over to page 37, if I may.
37.
37, if I may. At page 37, there's always some mild philosophical difference between our respective caucuses as to the extent to which the final conclusions we reach in the budgeting process are driven by a firm target of a mill rate, or whether or not it's more of a balancing back and forth between desirable services compared to desirable mill rate. The reality is that the 12 of us all mingle somewhere in the middle, and we actually reach a very healthy consensus, for which, by the way, I pat the 12 of us on the back. But this particular language, where it reads in the second paragraph, full paragraph, at a minimum, the guidelines should utilize a budget projection which contains and I was looking for a gentler word than targeted. Mary Lee, I had asked if you could use your great abilities. I was going to propose a substitute word for the word targeted.
We talked about potential or anticipated.
I would adopt Mary Lee's suggestion and say anticipated rate of change, using the word anticipated instead of targeted. I wonder if I could obtain a consensus from this board as to the substitution of the word anticipated for the word targeted.
And A to Ann.
So move.
Along with that, A to Ann.
I'm sorry?
Along with that, A to Ann.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you.
Do we require a discussion and vote, or can this be adopted by unanimous consent? Mr. Pellegrino?
No, it's a question.
Oh, I didn't hear you.
Does he have a second?
Second.
I don't know if I have a second. Oh, was that a second?
Discussion or unanimous consent?
Can I just ask Jeff a question, please?
Sure.
Jeff, what is really your concern here? What do you think you're really doing? And you really think it's just softening it? I mean, look, at the end of the day, we've got this range of 2 to 4% that we've been at for 10 years.
More, 13.
Time is going by.
Mm-hmm.
I just get this feeling like, you're trying to chip away at it, and I would say, well, why?
Sometimes the chipping away process produces a beautiful sculpture.
Yeah. I guess I'm not comfortable with this chipping away at that.
Yeah. Well, if I
Comment?
Hold on, so we'll take it to a vote. Mr. Pellegrino, then Hillier just spoke, Mr. Campbell, and then I saw some hands down there.
at first blush, it's like a lot of your proposals, Jeff. They sound very reasonable, and you try to parse them and figure out what's going on. And it's not always clear, and it may still not be clear to me. But I'm just noticing if you read the next, just keep reading through. It says right now contains a targeted rate of change, which the BET believes is an appropriate goal. Right, so it uses the word goal, and it seems to me that targeted is consistent with goal. Anticipated just kind of sounds like the BET is being passive about it and kind of just adding up numbers and seeing where it is. But if it's our goal, if we're pursuing a goal in the guidelines, then I think targeted makes sense. So I mean, it's not that I have a strong objection to your proposed change, but I think I like it the way it is.
Before I call anybody else, Mr. Raymer, who was your seconded on this one, just so it's clear?
Lee Kiernan.
Okay. Thank you. Just a little housekeeping there. Okay.
I have a question.
Mr. Finger.
Instead of the changing the words to an anticipated, I asked Mr. Raymer, Ms. Kiernan, and Mr. Campbell, and Mr. Pellegrino, do any of their thoughts change if we used an acceptable rate of change as opposed to an anticipated rate of change?
I would certainly adopt such wording.
Yeah, but again, it conflicts with appropriate goals.
Bill, I don't think my view would change. And the reason is targeted has a meaning, and I think it has the meaning in the context of the 10 or 12 years that we've had the budget guidelines with the range.
Okay.
And I guess I'm uncomfortable with trying to change that range unless it's
I was just trying to find middle ground.
Unless it's a lower and smaller range.
Mr. Huffman.
Indeed, I think, in fact, Mr. Pellegrino has put his finger on it. What we don't want, and what I think we've seen in some cases, is departments that have assumed that they can go to that number and not reach, not have any great criticism about the fact that they have increased their budget without necessarily justifying that they should. And I think we don't want to give them a number they think is a safe increase.
Further discussion. Ms. Kiernan.
Being the complete rookie on this board, I find anticipated or acceptable helps me understand the process a little better and ties better to the phrase you should utilize a budget projection which precedes anticipated. To me, it's a projection moving forward. We're looking at probably a lot of budget scenarios as we go through this process. It's an iterative process. And then we finally settle on it by consensus, as Jeff said. So I just, anticipated or acceptable makes far more sense to me, is more consistent, I think, with projection and the process as it stands.
Mr. Simon.
I like the word targeted. And the guidelines have always used a targeted rate of change in the tax levy. It implies, and this, I think, is the key point, that the guidelines in the budget are built from the bottom up, that we focus on the tax levy change and then build a budget around that. And I think that's been an important part of our fiscal discipline. I could address the other questions, and remember, this is the guidelines. This is not the budget, the guidelines. Comes out with saying, we're going to have a targeted change in the tax levy. Here's how far we're from that number, and this is what it is. Just because we're $2 million off in the guidelines doesn't mean that that department's going to be allowed to keep all of the money if they make the guidelines. We still have to have an effort to make the targeted rate of change. And this year's guidelines actually presents 3 different targets of 2.75, 2.5, and 2.25, and shows you how far you're off from each of those 3 targets.
Further discussion. Mr. Norton.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I prefer the word targeted because it's specific language as opposed to the other choices that have been proposed.
Further discussion. All those in favor of changing the word, we'll start with targeted to anticipated, and then Mr. Finger, if you want to make it.
I've adopted the change to anticipated, so that's the motion that's before. Anticipated.
Okay.
I've adopted Mr. Finger's change. I believe that.
No. Mr. Finger was different. That's what.
Oh, acceptable. I'm sorry.
So what are we voting on, Mr. Raymer? I'll leave it up to you.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I've adopted Mr. Finger's proposed change of acceptable, and that's the motion that I'm asking.
Okay, that's fine. Ms. Kiernan, you agree with that? Okay, so the motion that we're voting on is whether or not to change, strike the words "a targeted to" and "acceptable." Okay, all those in favor of that addition and/or deletion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. So it's, everybody raise their hand for, ayes, please, first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 7. Okay. That motion does not carry. Yep.
I'm now at the bottom of page 37 where I think a comment is appropriate. I would direct the body's attention to section 22C of our charter, which is reproduced.
Second by Mr. Finger. Discussion. Well, let me just say, I don't certainly have a problem with this or take issue with it, together with certain adjustments as set forth in Section 24 of the Charter.
Okay.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah.
Does this, are
Would you-
there
would
any
you please-
objection?
Would you please chalk this one up and kind of, and is it,
All right,
you
that's
know,
by
move
unanimous
on?
consent.
This is the Pellegrino gave me one, is that?
Okay, only if it's the last one. Is it the last one?
No, I got one more.
Oh, well, no, the deal's off. All right, moving on.
Well, I think this is one you won't find objectionable, on page 45.
30 what?
45.
45.
Last column, under FAS Raymer, my fax number in fact is 203-629-1844.
I can live with that one.
All right.
I got two from Pellegrino tonight.
Okay. By unanimous consent. Any others? Any other, is there a motion to approve the reference book as amended?
So it was made by Mr. Finger, and I second.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Motion's on the table.
Fair enough. So now, Finger, and Pellegrino. Okay, discussion.
Is it determined appropriation?
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention.
It says one opposing vote.
Finger Pellegrino was the original Finger Pellegrino. 10-1-0.
I'm not going to.
Okay.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Any other, Mr. Huffman?
I would beg your indulgence to make a brief comment about something that's arisen since our last meeting. Some of you may be aware of it. This happens to be a printed out copy I got today of the legislative language and analysis for the President's plan for economic growth and deficit reduction. It runs to about 300 pages in this printout. There's a lesson here, I think, and some of you may have come across it. It has impact for the town, and I think we all need to be aware of it. Among the various provisions in there is one that would alter the treatment of interest received had effect to cancel billions of dollars of financing across this country. We need to be continuously aware of the progression of this legislation and its impact, which may well increase the cost of our borrowing in January unless something significant happens.
See, Mr. Brady, we take anything that comes before us, even in a special meeting, and not even on a vote of two, and not even on a 2/3 vote. In any event, thank you for bringing that to our attention. Motion to adjourn?